Putin really has absolutely no interest in peace. Whatever Lavrov and Peskov, his sort of attack dogs are saying, that is no way out. I mean, Putin knows that peace now for him on the casualties he's suffered and the way the Russian economy has suffered, will be no victory.
Now, there's reports coming out from the ground that the Ukrainians are consolidating around Pokrovsk and taking back some territory, ostensibly to increase their defensive positions that are there. And then the Russians have been reporting that the Ukrainians have advanced up to 18 kilometers in Zaporizhia region. Yet there's other reports saying that the Ukrainians are being pushed back. And then further reports to say the Russians are building up a huge force for a spring-summer offensive. What do you think is going on the front line? And do you think the Russians are going to have the ability to put something of mass together, or are those numbers just numbers of people to be fed into the meat grinder?
Well, I think, Philip, is probably an area you are far more experienced and knowledgeable than me. The whole sort of psychological operations, the intelligence operations, which are so important in all types of warfare. And what you're describing to me is sort of, confusion and counterintelligence. The actual picture on the ground is fairly opaque. You mentioned in Zaporizhia, there's reports that actually the Russians sort of rather overextended themselves in their briefings to commanders, how well they've done.
What, the Russians tell mistruths? Never.
Well, absolutely. So, one view is that perhaps they're now, to prevent them being sent to the gallows in Crimea, they're sort of saying, well, actually the Ukrainians are doing rather well. And again, around Petros, Russia had expended so much manpower trying to take Petros over the last 12 months and hadn't really. Ukraine managed to put a foothold here. But again, as Western officials have been briefing and others, we're talking about meters here, or a kilometre or two, on a contact line that's 800 miles long, shifting a few feet a day for thousands of casualties. This is just incongruous in 2026. It would be incongruous in Passchendaele or Verdun, or the Somme, but over 100 years ago. So I think it is this opaque battlefield, and we know, better than I do, Russian propaganda and disinformation is what they're really good at. But Ukraine is pretty nifty too, and certainly one sort of gauges that Ukraine intelligence services, probably have the march on the Russian ones. So it is all part of what we're seeing. I think the bottom line is actually the very little movement is being taken place, but there are a lot of casualties, predominantly Russians. I mean, the Ukraine military, I think last week or the week before, were saying that for every one Ukrainian soldier killed, there were 30 to 40 Russians killed. That sort of ratio is remarkable, if true.
It is, but the Ukrainians keep their casualties even more opaque. But then, the Russians, it's interesting, this asymmetric type attacks. The Russians seem to be focusing their attacks whenever they're attacking the rear, instead of on military targets, on civilian targets. And we've seen them hitting the Ukrainian power infrastructure and the impact that that's having on power across Kyiv and other cities. But they also seem to be hitting hospitals and hospital facilities as well. Now, if I recollect, this is a tactic that the Russians used in supporting other despots around the world, like in Syria, where you've got experience. Are you seeing similar tactics to the Russians used in Syria and elsewhere being applied now in Ukraine?
Unfortunately, I'm seeing exactly that. And a briefing issued yesterday by the Physician for Human Rights has been detailing all of this. And actually, they were doing similar in Syria. When I was supporting medical facilities in northwest Syria, we saw exactly that through most of the conflict from 2012 to 2020. And certainly at one time, we reported that over 1,000 medics in Syria were killed, were attacked directly. Hospitals were attacked directly. We were having to move hospitals around, virtually every month to avoid being hit, because you will know and remember, that when there is conflict, there are areas that are supposed to be protected under Geneva Conventions, United Nations charters, etc., and hospitals, medical facilities, religious sites, etc. And in Syria, we found that virtually the day that we sent in the coordinates of our medical facilities to the UN, the next day we'd get some sort of missile through the roof, almost as though those 10-figure grid references were typed directly into Russian targeting computers. And it it had a profound effect. We will know as soldiers, the last thing you wanted to do go into any conflict is knowing that if you get injured, you're not going to be supported. It really saps morale, and for a civilian population, it's very, very damaging. So the report yesterday rather, says that Russia has attacked medical facilities over 2,500 times in the war. Over 400 medics have been killed, and over 120 children medical facilities have been directly attacked by the Russians. Now, the Russians will say this is either Ukrainians are using it as human shields, they're using medical facilities for military installations, which was exactly what they and Assad were saying in Syria. Now, in Syria, that was absolute rubbish, and it was a terrifying thing. And having lost so many medics, it was really difficult asking people to go back into these facilities. But they did, and ultimately, of course, it was the undoing of Assad and the Russians in Syria. But again, I think when we're looking at the way that the Russians are doing this is exactly their playbook. And you mentioned the beginning of the attacks on the power infrastructure. I understand from Western officials that over 50%, or Ukraine has lost over 50% of its ability to generate power and heat this winter. And something like 40 to 50% of houses and flats in Kyiv do not have power. Now that, I don't know what the temperature is today, but last week it was sort of minus 20. You put all this together, and this is a direct attack on the civilians. With my experience in Syria, that it seemed to be the Russian and Syrian view is that, if you kill enough civilians, eventually they'll give up. And actually, I was in Aleppo in December 2016, where the civilians did give up. 400,000 were resisting against Putin and Assad, and they did give up. And that really fueled the rest of the Russian and Syrian conflict there. But as we know, at the back end of last year, at the back end of 2024, of course, Assad and the Russians were defeated in Syria. And let's hope that's a portent of what might well happen in Ukraine as well.
Well, these lessons will hopefully come out at the Munich Security Conference, which is starting today. And as we come up, that's the last major conference that there is before we then get into this fifth year of this war in Europe. What do you think is going to come out of the Munich Security Conference? Do you think it's going to be significant? And do you think that there are going to be significant actions by the West, recognizing that a fifth year of a major conflict in Europe is something that is unacceptable? We're getting into Second World War lengths of conflict, and something has to be done to stop it.
Well, absolutely. And Second World War sort of casualty rates as well, or First World War when you look at the Russians. I think Western officials are quite upbeat, which I'm a little bit more circumspect about. I think this is the moment for the European NATO countries in particular to stand up. And Macron, French president, is sort of suggesting that. It is disappointing that the US are sort of sending the B team. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, I think is talking, but there are 60 Western leaders there. So Trump is the only major Western leader who seems to be absent. And again, you'll know better than I, the sort of messaging is very important in these sort of things. But if we sort of turn back to what we've been discussing for the last sort of 10 minutes or so, actually, if those European officials sort of agree with what I've been saying and what we've been discussing, then hopefully, they will feel they're in a stronger position. And if they show the resolve behind Ukraine, and if they really hear it and understand it in Moscow, and Putin hears it, then maybe there is a hope for peace. But I was very struck by briefings this week that people underlined that Putin really has absolutely no interest in peace. Whatever Lavrov and Peskov, his sort of attack dogs are saying, that is no way out. I mean, Putin knows that peace now for him, on the casualties he's suffered and the way the Russian economy has suffered, will be no victory. And even the very resilient Russian people will realise that. So I think Munich is an opportunity. One would expect to hear lots of strong cries, but it's critical, I think, that the European nations really sort of get behind it. And let's hope that US Secretary of State, again leans into this and realises that Iran might be the low-hanging fruit, but the real thing that is probably going to secure Trump's midterm elections and his Nobel Peace Prize is Ukraine, not all the other things that he's investing so much time and energy in at the moment.
So come on, I'm going to pass you my crystal ball and get it in there. What's going to happen in 2026, do you think?
Well, I hope that what will happen is that we will get a peace deal that the Ukrainian people can accept. And I think what freezing of the contact line as it is at the moment is a step forward. But it all seems to be about territory. And I think Trump has got to emphasize to Putin that he's got all the territory he's going to get, and he should be jolly happy with that. So I'm still upbeat, and I think you have to be upbeat. And one gets a feeling that European countries are getting their acts together. They are now looking to spend more on defence. NATO conventional defence in Europe is looking more secure, and the quiet resolve of our allies up in the north, the Baltics, the Nordic states, really gives me a feeling that actually, we hear a lot of sort of odd rhetoric in this country that people don't want to get involved and all the rest of it. But I think they should take a leaf out of the Finns and the Swedes, how they approach this and what they're doing. And I think if we show a combined resolve in Europe, then I think that will make a real difference. I don't see any way that Russia could make a significant breakthrough and charge on Kyiv, as Russian propagandists would have you say. Russia will try and hold on, and it's critical that European countries tread on those fingers that are trying to hold on and bring Putin to the peace negotiation table. So I don't think it's going to escalate. I don't think it can get any worse than it is at the moment, but it can get better. And let's hope that Trump realizes this rather more quickly, and that Europe is unified and speaks with one voice rather than the 20 or 30 voices it tends to speak with.
Well, let's hope we get that one voice coming out of the Munich Security Conference. The next few days will tell. And maybe to get business done, it's better that Donald Trump wasn't there and sends his B team, if we can describe Marco Rubio as the B team. But as ever, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Frontline.
Philip, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for watching Frontline. Now, in case you haven't heard, we've got our own channel now. So please subscribe whenever subscriptions start again. But of course, you can still listen to us if you want to on Times Radio at 01:35 hours in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time, but that is 20:35 Eastern Standard Time for those in the United States. And of course, please put your comments in and share our link with your friends. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.